Most of us think the brain learns from success. Do something right, repeat it, get better. But here's the strange part. The brain doesn't actually register success as a lesson. It actually hears it as a signal to relax. It thinks, this works, don't touch it. So it saves the pattern and stops paying attention. Which works until it doesn't. Because neurologically, success doesn't teach the brain very much. When something works, the brain mostly reinforces an existing pattern. It locks it in, but it doesn't update it. Real learning starts earlier than we think. It starts with something called prediction error. That's the moment when your brain expects one outcome, and reality gives it something slightly different. Not a disaster, not a failure, just enough mismatch to make the brain pause and go, wait. That pause is the learning signal. When there's no mismatch, nothing changes. When the mismatch is too big, the nervous system goes into stress. But when the error is small, noticeable but safe, the brain becomes more plastic. Attention sharpens, defenses stay low. That's the window where learning actually happens. And once you know this, you start noticing it everywhere. For example, let's look at how people study. Most of us were taught to learn by rereading notes, highlighting, going over material until it feels familiar, and familiarity feels productive. But neurologically, familiarity doesn't mean learning. What actually improves memory are practice tests. Not because you ace them, but because you don't. That moment when you're confident about an answer and then realize you were wrong, that's a prediction error. Your brain expected one thing, it got another, and in that moment, the memory updates. Research on learning and memory shows that retrieval practice, trying to recall information and then getting feedback, strengthens learning far more than passive review. Not because it feels good, but because it exposes small gaps. If the test is impossibly hard, people shut down. If it's too easy, nothing changes. Learning happens in the narrow middle, where you're wrong enough to notice, but safe enough to stay engaged. That discomfort isn't a flaw in the system. It is the system. And the same thing happens outside of studying, in everyday life. Once you understand how the brain actually learns, the goal isn't to avoid mistakes, it's to catch the small ones. Think about how people actually improve at things. Someone who gets better at conversations doesn't wait for a social disaster. They notice smaller signals, a moment where they spoke too fast, a pause they filled unnecessarily, a reaction that felt slightly colder than expected. Nothing wrong. Nothing to apologize for, just information. Next time, they slow down. They listen half a second longer. They adjust the timing. That's growth, and it happened without drama. The same thing shows up in work. People who improve quickly don't wait for performance reviews. They pay attention to micro-friction, a task that took longer than expected, a sentence that had to be rewritten twice, a decision that felt right but not clean. Those moments tell you where the skill is still forming, and if you catch them early, the adjustment is small. Miss them, and the correction later has to be big. This is what experienced people are quietly good at. They don't have better instincts, they have better feedback timing. They notice small errors close to the moment they happen, make a tiny correction, and move on. Over time, those tiny adjustments compound. That's why growth often looks invisible from the outside. No breakthrough, no turning point. Just someone who keeps getting slightly better because they're paying attention in the right places. So, if you actually want to make your small mistakes work for you, this is how. Pick one behavior you're trying to improve. As you're doing it, watch for the first moment that feels slightly off. Then give your brain feedback immediately after the action, while the situation is still fresh in your mind. That feedback can be simple. A quick mental note of what you do differently next time. When feedback happens this close to the action, the brain can clearly connect cause and effect and update the behavior efficiently. Neuroscience calls this temporal proximity. The shorter the gap between the action and the feedback, the more strongly the brain updates the pattern. That's because prediction error is time sensitive. If feedback comes too late, the brain no longer knows what to update. Think about the difference between Learning a language by using it in conversation versus learning it by studying rules and weeks later getting a test on it. The conversation gives immediate feedback, and so your brain adjusts in real time. Whereas the test gives delayed feedback, and by then, the prediction has faded. So the update is weaker. Once you understand this, improvement stops being about motivation or discipline. It becomes about feedback design. Instead of asking, how do I perform better? You start asking, what didn't match my expectation? What assumption was slightly off? What would I tweak next time? That's it. When you do this consistently, mistakes stop feeling personal. They become information. And once that shift happens, something subtle changes. Weakness stops feeling like a flaw because it's no longer about who you are, it's about what's still developing. The question stops being what's wrong with me and becomes what am I improving? We usually talk about big moments changing lives, but that's not how learning works. It's the smallest mismatches, barely noticeable, barely memorable, that quietly reshape how you think, react, and grow. That's what I call the inverse butterfly effect. Not the moment that explodes everything, but the tiny correction that changes what happens next. And that's how the brain actually learns.